Good afternoon. Hello. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm Tracy Fessenden. I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I am delighted to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event, The Missing Middle, Cosmopolitics of Spirituality in Arizona, with our special guest, Dr. Susannah Crockford from the University of Exeter in the UK. Today's talk is part of the CSRC Spirituality and Public Life initiative, made possible by the generosity of our dear friend, Penny Davis. The initiative highlights the importance of spirituality to the ethical formation of persons and citizens and to the institutions of public life that are vital to human flourishing. I'll be joined on stage for the Q&A by my colleague, Terry Shoemaker, who has also been very active in the Spirituality and Public Life initiative. One of the college's recent publications has Terry on the cover, leading students in his History of American Spirituality class on a field trip through Sedona, which is the subject of our speaker's last book, which I think your students had just read. Terry's also a scholar of American evangelicalism, religion and popular culture, and most notably, religion and sports. He is the author of a new book called Religion and Sports, The Basics. He is co-editor of the International Journal of Sports and Religion and co-director of the Sports and Humanities Institute, the Sports and Humanities Program Institute at ASU. So here at the center, we depend, of course, on the generous support from of our community to support our programs, which include student scholarships, fellowships, and research initiatives, as well as public education programs like today's event. You make all of this possible. I want to thank all of you who became friends of the center or renewed your friendship with the center in the last year. We appreciate your support so much. And for those of you who haven't, I invite you to consider investing in this community that we share. And you can find out how at csrc.asu.edu/support. As the school year wraps up, the center has one last event, which is taking place tomorrow, April 23rd at 6 p.m. in the Education Lecture Hall. The CSRC is partnering with the Arizona Persian Community Center to host, Through Her Lens, a conversation with director Rakshan Baniatamad. We'll be screening her path-breaking film, The May Lady, a poignant exploration of a woman navigating the complexities of motherhood and womanhood in the challenging religious and social context of Iranian society. The film will be followed by a conversation with the award-winning director, discussing the impact of her work and the inspiration behind it. As always, details about our events can be found on our website, csrc.asu.edu. Recordings of many of our past events can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you missed our conversation with David French, or last week's conversation with Carolyn Chen, or any of our events from the last several years, they are probably up there on YouTube, and I encourage you to follow us there. You can also sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it. Just a bit of housekeeping first. Please take a moment to silence or turn off your cell phones. Today's event is also being live streamed, so welcome to our digital audience as well. And for all of those who are here, I invite you to join us for a dessert reception served in the small attached room. So when the event is over, don't go out these doors before you go through those doors, because otherwise you will miss a beautiful spread of quite delicious treats, which we're eager to enjoy with you. So after Susannah's talk, Terry and I will start off the question and answer portion of the event with a short, moderated conversation. We'll then open up the floor for your questions. For those of you joining us online, you can submit questions at any time during the event to csrc@asu.edu. So now our esteemed speaker. Susannah Crockford is lecturer in anthropology at the University of Exeter, specializing in environmental and medical anthropology and the anthropology of religion. She is an affiliate of the Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environments of Health, the Egenis Center for the Study of Life Sciences, the Magic Center, and the Global Systems Institute. Her first book, Ripples of the Universe, Spirituality in Sedona, Arizona, was published in May 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. It was a finalist for the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in 2022. Susannah's second book is a multi-sided ethnography of climate change that examines the ethics and politics of wellness, health, and immunity in Southwest England, and I understand that book is just finished. has just been submitted to the publisher. We can look forward to seeing it in the next year or two. So please join me in giving Susannah a warm welcome.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. I'm very excited, especially because this is ASU, and this sort of means a lot to me because ASU sponsored my very first visa when I came to Sedona in 2012. So it is very, just wonderful. I am filled with gratitude to be able to be here today and share the outcome of that research so many years later. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is how spiritual beliefs affect political alignments and political action. And I'm going to talk about it through this word cosmopolitics. And I'm going to specifically start by talking about a place where a lot of you probably know, Sedona. You all probably know where Sedona is, but just in case anyone doesn't, it's a town about 2 miles north of here in the Verde Valley on the Oak Creek River, and it is set amongst these wonderful red rock canyons. It's about two or 3 hours south of the Grand Canyon. It's also quite close to Flagstaff and the San Francisco peaks. So this specific location has attracted all sorts of visitors, and it has gained it this reputation of being a spiritual power spot. People go there and they have all kinds of spiritual experiences, and it is said that it is a sacred place in spirituality. There are certain associations with indigenous myths. For example, this is the ancestral land of the Yavapai people. They called it Weepuk, and the area that is now called Sedona was said to be where the first man and first woman emerged from the earth. Now, there's a bit of a gap between that and the current articulation of spirituality in Sedona, which its contemporary history started probably about the 1950s and 1960s. There's not really a straight line between those two stories, although people will tell you that there is, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the contemporary history of Sedona really, as a spiritual place, this is really started with the actions of a few different groups and individuals, one of which was called Rainbow Ray Focus, also Ruby Focus. They are one of the first groups said to have discerned a vortex in Sedona, and they still have a site, a house, near one of the vortexes on Airport Mesa. It then came along to the 1960s, 1970s. An individual called Mary Lou Keller started holding yoga trainings in her building that she would rent out. She was a real estate broker. And then if you go to the 1980s, you have Paige Bryant and Pete Sutphin, who said that it was a power spot, and they released a book called Sedona Power Spot, and they started doing correspondence courses through mail, because this was the 1980s, saying you could learn how to develop your psychic abilities and discern these power spots. So what is a power spot? You know, I've already used this word a few times, a vortex. On this top image here, we have sort of one of the quite well-distributed vortex maps that you will get if you go to Sedona to find out where these vortexes are. So it's often said that they are 4 specific sites: Boynton Canyon, Cathedral Rock, Airport Mesa, and Bell Rock Vortex. Coincidentally or not, these are also very beautiful spots that lots of tourists go for hikes. So a lot of people will just visit these places just to go for a hike. But if you believe in the power of the vortexes, which are just sites of spiraling spiritual energy, where all of the confluence of earth energies are meant to meet and intersect. Some people say these ley lines go all around the world, and it's just at certain spots where there's a lot of them that intersect, like Sedona. There's others like Mount Shasta, and the other one's meant to be Hawaii, that you get these kind of special concentrations of energy. So why is it that there are 4? Well, that has to do with the tourists. So people started coming to Sedona, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, looking for this place that had gained this reputation as being this special spiritual place. And the more people came to see it, the more they needed local guides. And then for the local guides, they needed specific places to show them. And especially for people who maybe didn't want to pay a guide, they were like, well, you got to tell me where to go. I need an itinerary, right? I've got places to be after this. So they started to say that there were 4 specific spots, which are the 4 spots which are there on that map. The image is from the rock in Boynton Canyon. For the people who lived there for a long time and were quite engaged in spirituality, the idea that there were 4 is really for the tourists, or sort of for the beginners. It's like entry-level vortex knowledge, right? They would say that the whole area is a special place. The whole area is the vortex, and it in fact stretches all around the canyon area of Sedona, up as far as the San Francisco peaks, and down towards the Verde Valley and the source of the Verde River as well. So it's the whole area for them. It's not located in these 4 specific points. What do people do there? Well, as I said, some people will just go for a hike to see it. It's a very beautiful place. You can just go up and have a hike and have a nice view, which a lot of people do. But for some people, they go up there and do specific spiritual practices. For example, we have a picture here from a solstice ritual. There's me in the silly hat. We were participating in a solstice ritual on the Cathedral Rock vortex, and it involved all kinds of practices, including meditation, channeling, and some dance. And this is a crystal skull, so the person there is using a crystal skull to meditate while on top of the vortex. So the vortexes are said to enhance all of these spiritual practices, to make them more intense, to allow kind of experiences that wouldn't be possible in other places where the energy isn't as intense. And this idea of there being an intenseness of energy in Sedona is very important. So I mentioned that they use some references to the indigenous people of the area. What I was told over and over again in Sedona is that this area was sacred to Native Americans, but that they didn't live there, right? That they would come and do their ceremonies, but the energy was so intense that they wouldn't live there all year round. Now, I always had some skepticism about this because it's one of the few places with fresh water in this part of northern Arizona. It seemed logical that people would live there, and indeed, when I checked with an archaeologist colleague at NAU, she confirmed that indeed there is a recorded history, or at least an archaeological record of occupation of this area for tens of thousands of years, up until the 1890s when the Yavapai were forcibly removed to the reservation that is in Camp Verde. So we have to look at these myths of it sort of not really being occupied by indigenous peoples within this history of colonialism and the appropriation of the land that has now taken place through spirituality. Now, the town itself, as I've mentioned, is really geared actually not towards what these people are doing on the vortex in these pictures. The town is really geared towards tourism. Again, if you've been there, you may have noticed this. There's a lot of tourists, especially in the summer, especially if you're trying to drive around. You can spend an hour on the Y, just sitting in your car. The town only has about 10,000 people. There's 7,000 if you include the village of Oak Creek, although technically that's not part of the city of Sedona. People there will refer to the whole area as Sedona, though. Yet it has 3 to 4 million tourists visiting each year, a bit less during COVID. So the seasonal population of this town, massively fluctuates, and much of the economy is geared towards the tourists and the visitors. It is not geared towards the people who are engaging in spirituality. Indeed, many of the people who live there year-round tend to be wealthy retirees and second homeowners. This has only got worse since they allowed short-term vacation rentals, where Airbnb basically meant that private equity came in and bought up a lot of the homes, and they are now just rented out for holiday lets. Most of the people that I knew there when I was first there in 2012 can't afford to live there anymore. So in terms of the politics of the town, this is an affluent town. If you look at the census demographics, it's also a majority white town. It's about 91% people who consider themselves, when they're asked on the census, that they are white. So it has a politics, at least on the town level, that definitely reflects those demographics, which leans towards the more powerful people in at least the local politics, being things like the Chamber of Commerce, tends to be pro-business. It tends not to actually like so much the activities of the people who are quite genuinely engaged in spirituality and trying to kind of come there and live there and lead their spiritual paths. They often find it a quite hostile place to live. It can be very hard to live in Sedona for a long time. And this also tends to generate more of these stories that the energy in Sedona is so intense that you can't live there for very long. I got told numerous times that the energy will suck you in when Sedona wants you, but then when she's done with you, she'll spit you back out. And this really was a way of talking about how hard it was and how a lot of the population was quite transient, quite precariously balanced in this place where, if you really want to live here all year round, you've got to be like Senator John McCain level, or Orson Welles' daughter also has a property there. That's the sort of level where you can buy a house and live in Sedona. So most of the people I knew were not at that level at all. And then sadly, many of them have been forced to leave since then. So when I talk about the politics of the town, I just want to make sure that we understand that this is not the same as the politics of spirituality itself. And what I'm going to talk about more is the politics of spirituality. What do people engaged in spirituality, how has their politics been affected by their, let's say broadly, their cosmological principles, how they understand spirituality and their beliefs as they place them within that broad realm. So before I keep going on, I do go on a bit. I'm going to tell you a bit about me and why it is I came here and how often I've been there and sort of what I do. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm sort of an old school anthropologist as well, in that anthropologists traditionally go to a specific culture or town or area or region. They learn the language and they keep going there year after year. Because you see all kinds of things, right? You see change over time, you see seasonal rituals, you see how kind of this place develops over a long time, and it's really a long-term commitment and relationship with a specific place. Now, anthropologists would traditionally go to places like the Trobriand Islands in the South Pacific, but it's a lot different now, and I decided to come to Sedona in Arizona, and I've been to Arizona. So my first trip was 2012 to 2014, then I was in Sedona itself. I came again for 6 months in 2015 and again in 2016. That was in the Grand Canyon Williams area. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, there's a point where the 180 meets the 64 and there's a gas station there. You may not know this, but there's a whole town, not really a town, census designated place out there of people who live in like trailers and shacks and like buildings they built themselves. I lived out there. It was really interesting. And then in 2020 to 2021, I lived in Flagstaff. I call that the bad times. That was during COVID. I was in Sedona briefly in 2022, although I was mostly in Louisiana, and then I've come back this year and I am studying Scottsdale. So these are my periods of fieldwork. What I do is participant observation. So again, as an anthropologist, I don't necessarily go around asking people to answer questions on surveys or interviews. What I do is try and live with people as much as they do. So in terms of studying spirituality, this meant things like learning how to do yoga, learning how to do kung fu, meditating on the vortexes, spending 14 hours on top of a vortex waiting for a portal to open. That's a long story. It's in my book. So that's how I've studied this place over the years. And if you do want to read more, there is my book. It's already been introduced by Tracy, so I don't need to go on about that very much more. So I'm going to get back to what is spirituality, which is maybe a question some of you have thought already. So spirituality is really hard to define. Courtney Bender wrote this great book in 2010 called The New Metaphysicals, where she compared defining spirituality to shoveling fog, because the more you try and put a name on it, the harder it becomes to say anything about it at all. And this is also exacerbated when you ask people about spirituality. They tell you, well, there's no way you could possibly define it. Everyone interprets it their own way. It's their own personal spiritual thing, and you couldn't possibly group us together in any way. And it sort of has this reputation in the literature of sort of a non-formativeness and kind of amorphous style of, it gets called a milieu a lot, or a network, or something else that's quite diffuse and kind of hard to pin down. I thought that was all wrong. So I decided we could in fact define spirituality, and it takes quite a few pages in the introduction of my book, so I'm going to try and give you the short form, which is that spirituality is a constellation of beliefs and practices that revolve around this central organizing concept of energy. So this was sort of my PowerPoint version of a constellation diagram, and I try to introduce people to my definition of spirituality through certain terms, which I think really orient this whole way of thinking. So just as a first note, you may have heard this called the New Age. That's definitely what it was called in the 1980s and 1990s. I try not to use New Age these days for the reason that most people within this kind of way of thinking about spirituality don't like that term. They find it pejorative, offensive. They don't want to be called New Agers, so I'm like, fine, we're not going to call you that. So I'm going with metaphysical spirituality that you will find in Courtney Bender's book, and also more recent work, for example, by Matthew Harris, who's done some great work on the Black metaphysical tradition. And there's this sort of idea within the scholars who work on this particular field right now that we should define it as a tradition. And what we're going with is metaphysical spirituality. So I thought I'll go on that one. That sounds good. So it's metaphysical spirituality. It's organized around this concept of energy, right? What is energy? Everything is energy, right? Everything is energy, and it all vibrates at a certain frequency. So frequency and vibration are sort of characteristics of this concept of energy. You may have heard of things like good vibes and high vibes, and that's definitely the vibe, right? They're trying to raise their vibration, right? And by doing this, they will get to a place called ascension. So the spiritual path is literally just the thing that you're doing to raise your vibration that will then eventually lead you to ascension. Ascension is sort of this millenarian notion almost, right? Or sort of a sense of spiritual enlightenment. Once you go up through the various dimensions that structure the universe, you will eventually ascend and reach the fifth dimension or a higher dimension. And that is when you have achieved your ascension, which is sort of a state of spiritual enlightenment, a higher state of consciousness. Now, dimension is important because where we are now, for people in spirituality, is the third dimension. That's the world we live in. It's sort of characterized by mass, a density of mass, which means that you have a physical body, which means you have pain and suffering. It's not a good place to be. You have war, greed. That's the world we live in. So it's sort of a negative understanding of the world we're in, but then also a route to somewhere better, which is these higher dimensions where more spiritual practices become much more possible. Things like telepathy and teleportation are possible at higher dimensions. You can just make things manifest instantly by thinking about them. And that's where we're trying to get with ascension. And ascension is basically a more modern term for what was once basically called the New Age, right? This new era of peace and harmony where everyone's going to live in this higher dimension, this more spiritual place. For those of you who are of a certain age, you may remember the musical Hair. We talked about the age of Aquarius. That's that same concept, right? That's an astrological way of thinking about it, right? We're moving from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. These are all different ways of talking about this shift. You can also call it the shift or the new paradigm. Ascension is quite common, though, so I tend to use ascension. But it's a sense of like we're going somewhere better. We're going to get there, and the way we're going to get there is by following our individual spiritual paths. And what happens as we ascend through these dimensions is that we are in alignment. We are in alignment with the universe, right? And when you are in alignment with the universe, you have a sense of oneness, right? You are one with the universe. So the aim of the spiritual path is to ascend through these dimensions until you are perfectly aligned with the universe. You have become one with it. You are no longer experiencing separation. And that is the purpose of the spiritual path. So like I said, it's kind of a complicated definition, but I think it's good once you start to break down all the various different words, you start to make sense of when you talk to people, for example, in Sedona, and you see all these words, then you start to make sense of like where they're coming and how they fit together. Now, the reason why I've got these pictures of these two stores is because I have a much simpler way of introducing people to what spirituality is. And I'm like, you've probably seen it. It's like crystals and drums and psychics and astrology. And I think that, these stores are sort of like the easy way to introduce people to what spirituality is. But also, that's the purpose of these stores in Sedona, right? They're geared towards tourists. They're there to reel people in, or introduce people to spirituality at sort of a beginner level, a sort of a, this is what we do. And you may have come across these things before, and this is the place where you can find a lot of these practices all in one place. And then when you're there longer, you can start to learn more of these sort of more fine-grained distinctions about alignment in your spiritual path in the universe. The universe, by the way, is sort of an idea of divinity, right? God is the universe, also sometimes called spirit or source. And you can hear this, there's all these great phrases people use, things like the universe wants you to have this, or the universe is telling you something. So the universe definitely has agency in this way of thinking. So I came to understand it as that's what divinity is in this particular tradition. It is the universe, and that's why I started talking about cosmologies and cosmopolitics, because it is a way of understanding the structure of the universe, which we are all part of, because we're all part of the energy of the universe. So there's also, this is all quite positive, right? And another way of sort of talking about this is they use the phrase love and light a lot, right? So by raising your vibration, one of the ways you do that is you kind of increase more love and light in the world, right? Sounds very positive, sounds very good. There's another side to this, which some of you may be aware of, some of you less so. There are quite a lot of conspiracy theories in this way of thinking. These were always there, things like chemtrails, right? Chemtrails are the what you see, those white plumes coming out after aeroplanes that you see in the sky. Now, for some people, these are poison gas clouds being sprayed on purpose to make us sick or kill us or control our minds. That's what chemtrails are. There are local Sedona conspiracy theories too. For example, I was told often that so Airport Mesa is actually, it's called that because it's a flat tabletop rock with a private airport on top. I was told that the private planes that take off from the airport there dump their jet fuel on the houses below as they take off. Again, this is probably not true, but people in Sedona told me it was true. They were also very against smart meters. They thought that what they called the electromagnetic frequencies from smart meters were making them sick, or again, limiting their spiritual evolution. They were keeping them down. And this sense of there being mysterious forces in the environment that they couldn't control kind of moved on from smart meters to then talk about things like Wi-Fi and 5G. So a lot of them were environmental and medical. They were also very against vaccines, and that was true even from 2012 when I was first there. But they were also political. Again, 13 years ago, it was more like 9/11 was an inside job. Then 2020 happened and things moved on quite rapidly. So the mitigation measures for COVID-19 were interpreted by a lot of people in Sedona as a way of sort of directly contravening their principles about how health and wellness and well-being and even how the universe was constructed. You know, immunity to them is not produced through artificial interventions like vaccines. Immunity to them is supported by nature, by going outside in nature. Nature is, in fact, healing. You know, if you want to align yourself with the energy of the universe, one of the best ways to do that is to be out in nature, right? So going outside is healthy and very beneficial. Breath is also very important. You know, if you do anything like yoga, you will know that a big part of it is all about moderating your breathing. So the breath was also part of how you healed yourself. Now, in COVID-19, they were told that they had to stay inside, wear a mask, and get vaccinated. Now, to them, this seemed to confirm everything they had suspected about the government and all of these dark forces behind the government. So there are all these theories that the disease was a hoax. So this was taken from Instagram at the time. So you can see it's sort of laid out. This is one of my favorites because it lays it out very clearly. They faked this, that's COVID-19, so you will accept this, that's the vaccine. So they can biochemically connect you to this. This is a 5G tower. So again, these sort of mysterious forces in the atmosphere that you can't see, which they would call EMFs, they are what's kind of spreading the disease first to bats and then it went to humans. Some just claimed that it wasn't a hoax, that it maybe wasn't as bad as it claimed. That's what this second post is about, which is by someone who I knew for a long time in Sedona. It was sort of odd watching people change so dramatically, especially online. So this is sort of showing you the death rates and kind of indicating that the death rates haven't increased in 2020, so maybe it's not as bad as everyone's saying. And so a lot of this talk was going on online, which is where I got a lot of these examples, but it was also going on in person. This gentleman here with his Let Kids Breathe sign was protesting masks outside my son's school. My son, for reference, was 6 at the time. He felt like an elementary school was where he needed to be to help people wake up to the reality of COVID. So the reason why so much animus emerged at this time was because, you know, if you already think that health is supported by going outside, by through the free flow of your breath, through avoiding things like vaccines, doctors and politicians suddenly all come out and they start promoting vaccines, masks, social distancing. Well, they started to assume that there must be an ulterior motive, right? Can't possibly be what it is said on the surface. And then the theories became elaborated that these mitigation measures were actually aimed at depopulation and something they called the Great Reset, which is basically forcing the economy into a socialist political economy. And the COVID pandemic proved to them that all of their pre-existing theories about the government, about doctors, about scientists, that they were right, because look, here they were with this big emergency, forcing everyone to get vaccines. So it was also at this time that people involved in spirituality started getting a lot more notice from not just people like me, but from the media. And the term that came up a lot that was used was this term conspirituality, which is a portmanteau of conspiracy and spirituality. And the term comes from a 2011 article by Charlotte Ward and David Voas. And they described it at that time as an internet-based movement that gives purpose and meaning to people. And they identify 3 principles that are found in nearly every conspiracy theory. A, nothing happens by accident. B, nothing is as it seems. C, everything is connected. Similar principles are fundamental to much New Age thought and alternative spirituality. So what they were arguing is that the reason why conspiracy theories are so popular in spirituality is that they have the same conceptual principles underlying them both. This term has been used a lot. There's even a podcast, which some of you may have listened to, and they have a book. It's a little problematic, though. And the more I heard it, the more troubled I became by how much it was being used. And not just because I was like, you know, the media always kind of talk about things that you study deeply in a way that you don't quite agree with, but you're sort of glad that they're paying attention. But one of the problems is that Charlotte Ward, one of the authors, is actually a really big David Icke fan. David Icke is a very well-known British conspiracy theorist. So she is an insider, right? She was really into conspirituality. That's why she wanted an academic article out there legitimating the concept. David Boas was an actual religious studies professor at UCL, and he helped her put her ideas into academic form. So with it being an insider or emic theory, the problem is that it kind of highlights a very specific part and then makes that seem more prevalent. It takes one person's interpretation of this tradition and then expands it out until it stands for the whole, which is a problem we see repeatedly with insider theories. Not that they're inherently problematic, but just that they can be used in a way where one person ends up speaking for lots of others. Many people in spirituality do actually disagree with conspiracy theories. They're not all sort of addled as they often get depicted as, you know, and some people are just sort of open to the possibility but not really committed to the engagement with it. You know, you'll get some people who are very intense into conspiracy theories and they sort of talk at you really intensely, but you get lots of people who'll be like, oh, it's spraying a lot again, and I'd be like, spraying what? Spraying chemtrails. And that's like as far as the conversation goes, right? So there was this sort of like diffusion of some of the concepts among this culture and different levels of engagement. But one thing I always want to emphasize is that not everyone believes in conspiracy theories. My argument that I make, and again, this is in my book if you want more detail, is that conspiracy theories have a purpose, right? They do something in spirituality. It's a form of theodicy. It explains why evil exists, right? They've got this idea that we're going to this new era of peace and harmony and happiness. Well, why hasn't it happened yet? Well, there must be something stopping it, right? Dark forces are holding down our spiritual evolution. Now, at one point, the dark forces were often called the reptilians, which are the bad aliens. They're from David Icke. It was the NWO, or the New World Order, for a time, but over the last few years, the dark forces have been identified as the deep state. And some theories actually explain what these sort of dark forces do to spirituality explicitly. So, for example, I was told that chemtrails, as well as poisoning us, depopulating and everything else, they specifically, what they do is they block your pineal gland, which is meant to be here around your third eye, and that is meant to be the anatomical location of our connection to our higher self or source. So there was this idea that conspiracy theories were specifically limiting spiritual evolution, right? That's what they're after, right? And I came to understand that spirituality was the solution for the problems that conspiracy theories diagnosed. A lot of conspiracy theories, as silly as it may seem, or as unrealistic as it may seem to believe these things, actually refract real social problems. Chemtrails may not be real, but airplanes are not good for our atmosphere. Fluoride may be good for your teeth and not poisoning our water, but there are corporations poisoning water in different extents in different places. Vaccines are good for preventing diseases, but pharmaceutical companies have done some egregious crimes against people. So they're not entirely wrong, right? There are real social problems here, but what they do is they start talking about it in this way that individualizes where these problems come from. So I'm not entirely sure how good I am on time, but I'm going to take a moment now to talk about how do people actually talk about conspiracy theories in Sedona. I'm going to use an example from 2022, which took place in the crystal shop, which is why I have all these pictures of lovely crystals for you to look at. So I went into a crystal store in West Sedona, and there was a British Asian woman there named Vicky who explained to me the idea behind their store, which was that it was different to other crystal stores in Sedona. Other stores just sold the stones and send people off with their crystal Bible or whatever, and they figure out the meanings by themselves. But what they did in their store was to show people how to connect with the crystals for no charge. You don't have to buy the crystal, but what they're going to do is help people understand what that specific crystal means to you. So her husband, Billy, who was an American, did the readings and showed people how to connect with the crystals in the office in the back of the store. She suggested that I find a crystal, the one that spoke to me specifically, and then using my intuition, pick up that one I want, and he'll show me how to connect with it. So I just picked up a green stone, basically because it was called Atlantisite, which is a reference to the lost continent, and I'm always slightly fond of these lost continent archaeological theories. And so then Billy came out and he greeted me, and Vicky asked him how to show me to connect with the stone, and they took me into this back office that was very small, and there were no windows. It just had those crystal salt lamps, you know, the kind of orange glowing ones. And then there was a low Tibetan throat singing meditation music in the background. There was incense burning. It was a really intense sensory environment that sort of felt like spiritual hotboxing. And then Billy got me to hold the crystal in my hand, and he spoke in a low tone, like in a guided meditation. And he told me I needed to focus on what the stone meant to me, focus on that specific word, and imagine myself going inside the stone, and the stone was dissolving. And my word was understanding, because I was there to understand. He asked me how I felt, and I said, well, I'm a bit relaxed. And then we got talking, and it turned out he had a lot to talk about, and it was mostly about himself. He talked about crystals, how he became aware of his intuitive abilities, how he moved to Sedona with Vicky and worked as a psychic reader, first at one of the resorts, but then they opened their own store. And then he talked to me a lot about conspiracy theories. These ranged from the archaeological, ancient aliens built the pyramids with nuclear weapons and hydrogen-generating power sources, to the political. 9/11 was an inside job, COVID was a hoax, to the historical. They killed John F. Kennedy because he was going to give everyone free energy, dissolve the Federal Reserve, and return to the silver standard. They were the deep state, who used fear to control people, and anyone was expendable to them. So what they want is for everyone else to believe that you're living in a dystopia, because then you'll be afraid, and then you'll be easier to control. He did like Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader. He thought he was great, down to earth. That was a quote. He told me the Ukraine war was completely fake because Ukraine was the most corrupt country, and then everyone started talking about it like it was a paradise attacked by the evil empire. I mean, come on. He also thought Hunter Biden was involved down there. Now they control, they being the deep state, everything except consciousness. And this is why spirituality is so important in this dynamic. Consciousness is beyond mind, so they can't control that, right? They control your minds, but not consciousness. So they try to destroy things that expand consciousness. He described us as being in an abusive relationship with the state. He indicated that he thought everything was falling apart. I asked if he thought a second civil war was coming, because I've heard this a lot since I started my research, and he said that he foresaw the state collapsing in on itself like Rome, rotten from the inside. He said that some people thought Trump will save us, but his opinion on Trump was that he sounds like an idiot, saying really stupid stuff in his speeches, who repeats himself a lot. All presidents are pre-selected, he told me. So I came for a crystal, and I heard a lot about conspiracy theories. And the politics of those conspiracy theories pointed to an anti-politics. All politicians are corrupt. None represent the people, only themselves. Everything's controlled by the deep state, and dark forces are behind the scenes. So you don't really know their names or faces, but that's where the real power is. Everything you see in the media is just for show. So why would you even bother voting, right? If it's all already been decided for you. But some have this secret knowledge, right? It is hidden to those of us who are asleep. We're the sheeple, we don't see this. But it is known by those who are awake. And this sense of awakening also connects spirituality and conspiracy theories, right? They both use this metaphor of awakening, right? You awaken to the truth, you see the light, either of your spiritual path, but also of all of these dark forces that control the universe. So what are the politics of spirituality? Well, it's complicated, and it doesn't fit very neatly into either left or right-wing categorization, as hopefully you've already seen from that vignette. I think there's sort of an assumption that people involved in spirituality are left-leaning Sometimes I hear them called far left. They're definitely not far left. And I think a lot of that is sort of a legacy from the counterculture associations from the 1960s, from when the New Age really was the New Age, right? But by the time I got there in the 2010s, very few people identified with a political party at all. I met a couple of people who told me they were registered Democrats and they were quite politically active, but that was it. A better fit was anti-politics, because they saw all politicians as corrupt, and they don't pay attention to politics, for not just because they believe it was all corrupt, but also because they thought it would lower your vibration, and also that of the planet. So you're in fact actually causing harm to yourself and others if you engage in politics. So you don't talk about politics. They have this idea that you create your own reality, right? So if you are talking about what is working against your spiritual path, i.e. politics, what you're doing is keeping you and the people around you in the third dimension. You're keeping us stuck here by talking about it and focusing on it and going Trump, 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 or whatever. Now, there has been some change over time. They were very big into Bernie Sanders in 2016, which was interesting. But then they saw what happened with the DNC, and they saw it as this massive betrayal and like another sign of there was a conspiracy working against them. It also made them personally against Hillary Clinton in particular, because she had benefited from that situation. So then we move on to 2018, and something called QAnon, which maybe you've heard of, sadly, spread rapidly amongst spiritual communities online and in Sedona in person as well. So I saw my first QAnon video. It was in mid-2018. It was posted by someone who was a shaman and a starseed. His name's Randall Stansworth Bear. He is a white guy who claims Cherokee ancestry, and he posted this Joe M video to YouTube. So QAnon, as you may sadly know, basically added the child trafficking claims of Pizzagate to various medical and environmental crimes of corporations, mixed it together with pre-existing ideas and themes and motifs. Many of them were more in line with right-wing conspiracism than with the sort of anti-corporate medical and environmental conspiracies that were much more common among spirituality before then. During COVID-19, this situation became much more known about in the media, which is where you started to get headlines like this one: experts warn of radicalization pipeline as Sedona wellness communities, anti-government groups share space, and crunchy to alt-right pipeline. They also call it the conspirituality to alt-right pipeline or wellness to alt-right pipeline. It's not really a pipeline. I have a lot of problems with this framing. The politics of spirituality are often quite poorly understood. What I think happened is that they shifted from this sort of quietist anti-politics, quietist as in it sort of encouraged them to do nothing, to a more outspoken, at least on social media, sort of conspiracism that was more in line than it had been before with right-wing conspiracism. So this presence of dark forces became much more urgent for them as these global events impinged on their lives personally. Some are more explicitly MAGA now. They tend not to be traditional Republicans. Like, they're not Bush Republicans or anything. They're definitely MAGA if they've gone Republican. And some see Donald Trump as a light worker. A light worker is sort of one of these spiritual practitioner categories where you're purposefully trying to increase more light in the universe in order to aid the spiritual evolution of yourself and the whole planet. So they think Donald Trump is one of them. They're not really radicalized as such, though I would argue. Often it's quite a small step for them, from the things they already believed to kind of slotting Donald Trump and QAnon into these things as well. They tend not to be violent or activist. That's why I say they're not really radicalized. They're still not doing very much about it, at least not compared to some other groups who have taken in some of these conspiracy theories. What they do tend to do is focus on individual rather than structural causation. So COVID-19 was not simply a new virus hitting an underfunded public health infrastructure. It was, in fact, caused by specific individuals and groups who are using it, or just the idea of it, as a weapon. Therefore, it was an attack rather than a misfortune that had been exacerbated by systemic inequalities. And this is where, oh, I have a timer there. This is where this concept of cosmopolitics became useful to me. So it is a concept from the philosopher of science Isabel Stengers, and I take it to mean how cosmologies have political implications. So cosmologies refers to theories about the structure and nature of the universe, and they can be scientific or they can be religious. If we think back to the kind of broad definition I introduced, the universe is a central concept in this for how they think about reality. So that may seem very distant from politics, which is this worldly and third dimensional. The universe in this context is understood in terms of pantheism, so everything is energy that constitutes the universe means that the universe or divinity is in everything. Thinking in spiritual terms, therefore, allows people often to bypass politics entirely. In the case of spirituality, I identify what I call the missing middle, which is where social change is thought to occur on individual, i.e. your spiritual path, your personal actions, and then go straight up to cosmological levels, the universe, not the social or collective level. So individual spiritual action is what affects change. And then by skipping over this middle level of the social, it creates effects on a cosmological level. This is seen as more effective than political action. It also means that in person in Sedona, it is often quite hard to form groups. No one really wants to follow each other. No one really wants to go along with what anyone else is doing. Everyone's on their own individual path. I had these experiences again and again where they were like, we're going to start this thing. We're going to get up at dawn every day and go meditate. And we do it for a week. And then someone would be like, oh, no, this is just not, it's not what I need to do right now. I need to go take care of my own thing. And then we'd all fall apart and no one would talk to each other anymore. And that happened a lot in lots of different contexts. So there's sort of an interpersonal way that this kind of inability to work collectively manifested. But it also meant that they weren't working together to bring about the social change, even though they did seem to see this as necessary. I'm going to give an example of this. So this is from 2012. And it's someone who I call Buttercup, but that's not her real name. She called herself a spiritual teacher. So she offered courses at festivals, and also the local vegetarian restaurant in Sedona, online, and also at friends' houses, some of which she would charge for. She also ran a business making kombucha, which they called Alchemy. She later ran wellness and women's empowerment retreats in exotic locations like the US Virgin Islands and the Bahamas. She also had some passive income. So before all of this, she went to college in Massachusetts, and she told me how she used to be an activist trying to save the world, but she gave that up when she was 22 because she realized that activism in fact helped perpetuate the problems it claimed to be working against. Because, she told me, when you say no war, the no is lost energetically, and the more you repeat the word war in your thoughts, the more war there is in the world. The energy of the word war is what spreads out through the universe. So instead, she focuses on peace. And first, she told me, you have to align yourself before you can bring peace to anything else. So therefore, the right place to start your action is on yourself. Fix yourself first. This is more important than getting people to vote, for instance. And then it also connects your hearts, and you fix others through fixing yourself emotionally. So by working on yourself, you help others, and then the universe. But it's not direct. It's more like a form of diffusion, or like the 100th monkey idea, which is this quite contested and outdated and not really right idea in biological anthropology. That it was based on a study of Japanese macaques, and they said that if you taught a certain number of the macaques a certain skill, the rest of them just learned it without having to be directly shown. Again, it didn't really work. They never managed to repeat it. Who knows what was going on with those macaques? But they had this same idea in spirituality, where that when you fix yourself energetically, it then travels out from you on this energetic vibration, especially through words. Like, your words are very important, which is what these memes are for. They're some of my favorites. So words have their own energy and therefore power. Words cast spells. That's why they call it spelling. Words are energy. Use them wisely. So if you talk about Trump, Trump, Trump all the time, you're going to get more Trump. Talk about war, war, war all the time, you're going to get more war. And this one, it says the best spiritual protection is emitting your own unique vibration. So you've got to do your own thing and follow your own path. Fix yourself, and then you'll fix everyone else. So you don't need to talk about politics. Not because you don't care, but because that will bring the vibration down. not just from you, but everyone else around you. And then no one else will want to be around you either. And it's hard enough being around people in this town anyway, so you didn't need to make it harder. So I'm British, as you can probably tell. And British people, we complain a lot. We have quite a dark sense of humor. We can come across as quite sarcastic, especially to Americans. And I found when I was first there, this did not go down well at all. And I had to very quickly stop talking like I would talk to people at home and just start being more positive, because otherwise people didn't want to be around me. And I realized that, you know, this was because they thought I was lowering the vibe. So you had to speak positively. So for example, Buttercup would say, if you love rather than if you like, because that had a higher vibration. Because you are doing this. What you're doing, you are creating your own reality by everything you spoke, everything you did. This is often used, the word manifestation is used, which by the way has got super big on TikTok. All my students know about manifestation now, which makes me very happy because it means my research is relevant, not because I actually think they're doing manifestation. But it's this idea that you can make what you want happen through your thoughts and your words, right? You can create it in your life. So it's very important to put your high vibrations out there. That's how you raise the vibrations of other people. And then it goes out from there to the planet and then the whole universe. So where does this leave this middle level, the missing middle? So the effect of this way of thinking is that it produces a form of politics that prioritizes the cosmological principles of spirituality. And this, in the process, collapses any easy left-wing, right-wing distinctions. And it also tends to avoid coherent positions on the left-right binary. So it doesn't really fit to say that spirituality is either left-wing or right-wing. Certainly they would never say that about themselves because they don't like labels. What it does do, though, is it denies systemic causality. So, for example, on things like environmental pollution, right? Environmental pollution doesn't happen because corporations are poorly regulated and profits are prioritized over their externalities, which, you know, go on to harm our environments. No, it's happening because people are specifically out there spraying it into the atmosphere to poison you, right? It's a direct attack. So there's an over-attribution of agency. And this leads to the appeal of conspiracy theories or conspirituality. It also makes specific individuals have a lot more power in their explanations. I often find myself talking about different types of billionaires and how there are good billionaires and bad billionaires is what I've discovered depending on who I'm talking to. So I will talk to someone and they'll tell me all about their theories about how Elon Musk is great because he earns so much money, so he doesn't really need any of this, right? So that's how you can tell he's transparent and doing the right thing. George Soros, on the other hand, he's got so much money, you can tell he's up to no good. Now, obviously, George Soros is Jewish, so there's anti-Semitism there. But I also see this the other way around as well. You know, Elon Musk is up to no good. He's a bad billionaire. He's poisoning our environments with this, that, and the other. Whereas then there's the good billionaires who are funding the causes that they agree with. So it's always the individual who is at the root of the problem, right? It's individualism, or we can't identify them at all, and it's the deep state. This leads to this idea of these kind of empty and sort of vague, but at the same time deeply heinous enemies that we can take on. So the system is not the problem, but it's pathologies. And it's the individual who has the cause or blame for these pathologies. So this leads to a lack of social critique. Instead, what they have is conspiracy theories. There is a fine line between critique and conspiracy theory, and this has been commented on by Bruno Latour and Didier Fassin. Joseph Masco and Lisa Wedeen, for example, called conspiracy and critique the necessary twin other. And I think this is why someone like Bernie Sanders really appealed to them, because his critique of billionaires and corporations and their actions and the effects they have on people's environments sounds a lot like what they're saying. It's just Bernie Sanders isn't saying chemtrails. So the solution to the world's problems is also not the sort of political action that someone like Bernie Sanders would recommend. The solution to the world's problems is more spiritual practice. So first, you work on yourself, you follow your own spiritual path, and then it ripples out from there to the universe, from individual ascension to planetary ascension. This means that political action like going to protests, voting, or running for office is the wrong approach, indeed counterproductive. What you're doing there is focusing on keeping the planet in the third dimension. What you need to do is elevate yourself, and then from there, everything else is going to go to this higher state of consciousness in the fifth dimension or higher, and that is how we're going to solve our problems. So this leads to a loss of this mid-range thinking, because you're skipping over from the individual to the cosmos. What you're skipping over is society. right? And you lose social or systemic thinking. So what you have on the one hand is basically a form of neoliberalism where individuals are responsible for everything. And then on the other hand, what you have is cosmological thinking, which is so vast that it could only be accounted for with some extra human intervention or some dark shadowy force you can't name. People don't think about society, only individuals, and then the cosmos. And in the end, the individual and the cosmological end up as these opposing poles that inflect each other, where politics can only be imagined as hinging on behavior and choice, in part because individuals are seen as belonging to these individually accessible cosmic orders, or, on the other hand, to these vast networks of conspiracy. These transcendental orders become conceivable and compelling because there is always something there that inheres in the individual. So you can relate this cosmopolitics of spirituality to the post-politics debates in political philosophy, where thinkers in this debate argue that there is no alternative to capitalism in the world we live in now, just how to manage it technocratically, and it is therefore always best managed by domain experts, and decision-making is increasingly considered then to be a question of expert knowledge, not of political position, but this leaves very little space for democratic participation, and lacking that space, populism flourishes. The flaws of the system are blamed on outsiders, individuals, and unspecific them who are doing everything wrong, and then instead people reach for a powerful individual, perhaps a strong man who can fight on behalf of us, and then we end up with them versus us polarization. So this middle level is actually really important, especially for things like public health and elections. We are reliant on trust and cooperation. We need to know that on some level, the things we're doing, even if they aren't directly helping or hindering ourselves, are doing something for everyone else. Otherwise, we're not going to do them. And without that, this concept, which goes all the way back to Emile Durkheim of the social, gets lost. The universal gets reached for because these deep-seated complex problems like climate change, pandemics, and inequality are not confined to national, geographic, or social boundaries, and then that makes people feel like society is being dissolved. Spirituality skips this middle level of the social and connects the individual spiritual path to a cosmological transcendence. And in the process, people feel empowered. They feel like they can do something, right? If it's a specific person attacking you, well, you can do something back. If it's just a systemic problem, it's so much harder to solve, and then people feel disempowered. So the individual spiritual practice they do, they see it as more effective, or at least it's more reachable. It's something they can do, rather than engaging with the messy, complicated middle level of society and all of its political divisions that everyone at the moment seems to feel powerless about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susannah. I think Terry's going to start us off.
Yeah. First, thank you so much. It's like you mixed in your book with some new ideas towards the end, especially, and I'm a fan of your book. I wanted to ask you, one of the things I really appreciate about your work specifically is spirituality stands on its own. Spirituality doesn't need religion. Right? So like a lot of scholars, when they talk about spirituality, spirituality is a subcategory within religion. Spirituality is something that religious people do, but do in their homes, right? But I wanted to ask a specific question with your consultants that you worked with, specifically about what do they think about traditional or institutional religion? Is it part of the deep state? Is it an antiquated something? Is it something that was good but lost that goodness out of it, like it's lost its message? Where does religion fit? I'm not saying they're religious, right? But like, where does religion fit from their perspective?
Yeah, they're not a fan. But I think it's not part of the deep state, but it is on this level of something that was at one point useful, but is no longer so. So it's become corrupted. A lot of the people that I speak to who have turned towards the spiritual path have had an unpleasant interaction with some form of what I would call organized religion. At some point, a lot of them had left things like evangelical churches, or they had parents who were in those churches and they felt that that was very dogmatic. Similar relationships with Catholicism and the sort of, stories about sexual abuse in churches also came up as a reason not to want to follow religion. But they specifically thought about religion as organized religion, right? It's dogmatic, it tells you what to do, you have to follow all the rules, and that's what they don't want to do. And they see spirituality as something more free and more open where they can create it themselves. But I would say that spirituality is religious in sort of a broad sense. I would agree that it's not part of an organized religion. It doesn't have an institution, doesn't have a sort of system of support for its practitioners. They don't have a guaranteed congregation or anything like that. So they call themselves conscious entrepreneurs. They got to support themselves, which is why they often get this accusation of being fake and commercial. But we've all got to live and make a living. But they're religious in the sense that, they're doing things that you could sort of identify as religious. And what I tend to mean by that is sort of relationships with more than human beings, right? They're stretching and reaching to that more than human level. They're not just being rational, secular empiricists. So it's religion, but they definitely don't like organized religion.
Right. So just to follow up very quickly. In Sedona, so the trend of identifying as spiritual but not religious, in Sedona, is there not a need to say that because spirituality stands on its own there? Yeah. And so they don't
really use SBN. Yeah. They don't say spiritual but not religious. They just say, I'm spiritual, I follow a spiritual path.
Right.
I want to follow up on this as well. We have the Spirituality in Public Life initiative in part because we have so many students who identify as spiritual, and most of them say they're spiritual but not religious. And sometimes that's because they have had a deconstruction, as the kids call it now, right? They've left behind mm-hmm. a religious upbringing or a religious home of some kind because that was unsatisfying to them, and often for very good reason they have struck out from there. But then there are a lot of people who say they're spiritual but not religious because they have no religious literacy. And they think this spirituality stands on its own, and they kind of invented it, and it's all great. And they have no idea that most religions in the world, looking at or folks who practice a religion, looking at your diagram of what spirituality is, would say, yeah, we do all that stuff too. That's Jewish spirituality, or that's Benedictine spirituality, or that's Buddhist spirituality. So there's kind of an arrogance I see in assuming that what you do in Sedona is spirituality, and what those who might come out of a different set of circumstances call spirituality that may or may not align with a religious view. But when you think about the missing middle, what is missing from your diagram of what spirituality consists in is ritual, community, narrative, ethics, exemplars, icons, all the stuff that a conspirituality or a conspiracy theory might rush in to fill, mm-hmm. right? So this sense that they're not religious, that there's nothing religious about what they're doing, seems to ring false for me. In that as you say, conspirituality or the conspiracy theory is the theodicy. I see it as the entire theological scaffolding that's missing from their sense of spirituality. But I also wonder if there is. You suggest that there is just an attitude of an eagerness to sort of dismiss religion is not really enlightened, right? But so much of what seems to be happening now in evangelical Christianity parallels what I see in your discussion of spirituality. These are people who more and more folks who identify as evangelical Christian have never read the Bible, have never gone to church, believe Donald Trump is a light worker. There's just a whole vacuum that is being filled with this conspirituality kind of thinking. So I just wondered if you might comment on that.
Yeah, so I think you're right about spirituality being very open. Sort of the entry the threshold is quite low. Let's put it that way. If you want to think about it like conversion, right? Often all you have to do is, read some stuff on the internet and just decide for yourself that's what you're doing. And then you can learn some practices. Not all of the practices are easy, but, Yeah, it's sort of open, it's available, you can kind of enter it, and it doesn't have all that baggage, right? In a lot of places, religion has a lot of historical baggage, not just contemporary kind of baggage, but, you know, people sort of want to get away from the sectarianism of religion. So some of the most, one of the things that happens to me when I talk about spirituality in Sedona is that nearly always in the crowd, someone's like, oh, they do that where I'm from. And then I get to hear all about spirituality around the world. And I had a colleague once who worked in Lebanon who told me like, oh yeah, I know people who are into that because it means they don't have to be Jewish or Muslim or Christian, right? It's like this other way of being religious that's sort of open and flexible and non-sectarian. So I think that's very appealing. I think it's especially appealing to young people, especially because a lot of it is spread online, so it's sort of where they're at. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think where it can be a bad thing is where, so you talk about like there's an arrogance with it. So I talk about this as like the imperialism of spirituality, where they can just go take whatever they want from wherever they want. And this gets very problematic, especially when you're appropriating things like indigenous practices. You know, not all cultures are open and available to converts. Some explicitly say, these are our practices, you can't take them. And especially with indigenous practices, things like sweat lodges and vision quest, people in spirituality will just do them without any sense of where they're from, what they mean, or even how to do them safely. So it can be very problematic. There's also some that sort of imperialism sort of is one of the things that I think makes it sort of travel so easily, because it can sort of take over anything else by absorbing other traditions into it. A lot of different sort of symbols and motifs of all different religions get absorbed into spirituality, some more than others. There's a lot of Buddhism in it, for example. Where I'm from in England, so I live quite close to Glastonbury, which is like the Sedona of the UK. They use a lot of like kind of Celtic influences, like the ancient peoples of Britain, which is a bit easier because like they haven't been around for thousands of years. So, you know, no one's going to say anything about what they did. And we also don't know. So you can just kind of, you know, be inventive about it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being inventive with your religious practice. But I think that just it's sort of interesting as to, you know, they say they can pick and choose from everywhere, but actually they pick and choose from some pretty conventional sources. And there's some that they tend to not pick and choose from. Like I see very rarely Islam being used in any sort of spiritual path, which I find quite interesting. And sort of to the end of your point, which I've now forgotten.
Oh, about evangelical Christianity is starting to look a lot more like.
So this is really interesting. So one of the things I've written about a lot recently is this sort of overlap between spirituality and Christian nationalism, or like, which a lot of it is evangelical, but it's also in Catholicism as well. This sort of like turning towards like a traditional, quite conservative form of religion with a lot of sort of social conservatism as well, and a very strong sense of like America is a Christian country, and but then all these conspiracy theories that are associated with that, and that's where it overlaps with spirituality, who don't tend to be nationalists, but then suddenly, especially in online spaces, they sort of get along with these quite right-wing, quite Christian nationalist people because they have these similar ideas about the deep state who are like working against us, and like the status of Donald Trump and QAnon, right? So the two of the big audiences for QAnon, one was, you know, the traditional right-wing conspiracists who are often also Christian nationalists, but the other one was people in spirituality. And a lot of people were like, this doesn't make sense. And I was like, no, it makes total sense. Like there's this massive overlap. And if you want to understand the overlap, there was the guy in January 6th with the horns and the painted face, and he's called Jake Angeli, and he's from Scottsdale, Arizona. Anyway, he calls himself a shaman and a starseed, and he is into both sides of this. Like he was raised as a Bush Republican in Scottsdale and then had this experience with magic mushrooms where he decided he was on a spiritual path, and now he's a shaman and a starseed, which is an alien in a human body. Again, that's in my book. You want to hear more about aliens? So yeah, there's a massive overlap there, and it's really interesting.
Just a quick follow-up before we hear again from Terry. I was very glad that you mentioned the removal of the native inhabitants of Sedona in the 1890s, because the view that the Indians are here spiritually has a long history in American imperialism and in spiritual practice as well, in the form of seance Indians who would always seem to show up for spiritualist seances in the 19th century. As Indians were being decimated in the flesh, right?
So they
show up as spirits, and that's good. You know, a good Indian is a ghost, right? A good Indian is a spiritual Indian.
Yeah.
And so this has a long, quite sordid history. So I'm glad that you raised that, Terry.
Yeah. So I really liked how you wrapped up in thinking about the middle. and thinking about civic engagement and thinking about the sociological. I was trying to think as you were presenting your information about the people that you study and you study with, and I kept finding myself going, if I were being generous, how would I understand this?
Yeah.
Right? And so, and I kept coming back, even before you got to the end, of thinking about there's the middle fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
It's the, I totally hear what you're saying about we need civic engagement, we need to have civic responsibility, but when you feel like none of that is going to do anything, I wonder if it does come back as the idea, well then, if it's not working, there must be a deep state because none of us are making any headway in this thing. And so how much of this is, I hate to phrase this question this way, how much of this is a response to kind of late stage democracy?
Yeah, like the sort of paralysis in liberal democracy combined with late stage capitalism. I think that's sort of the political economic backdrop where everyone sort of, not everyone, I don't want to speak for everyone, a lot of people feel like there's very little they can do, that a lot of things are wrong, they would like to do something about it, but they can't. And all you're being told you can do is vote, and then you vote and nothing changes, and you just sort of end up with the clone on one side or the clone on the other side. And then someone comes along who's radically different, you're like, oh, we'll go for him because that's real change. But then that ended up being much worse. So then you just feel like it gets worse and worse and worse, and what are you going to do?
You're going to create a systematic spirituality.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Meditate. It does make you feel better as well, though. I end up very chilled when you meditate all the time. I'm not critiquing anyone for choosing to meditate instead.
At least you feel like you're doing something.
Right? And you feel better.
Yeah.
And sometimes that feels like all you can do.
Right.
We're going to open this up now to audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will call on you, but please don't start your question until you get the mic, because that way you will be, we will hear you in the recording, otherwise we won't. If you are listening at home and you'd like to ask a question, please email it to us at csrc@asu.edu. We'll get to as many questions as possible, and please be succinct and only ask a single question.
So I also loved the missing middle component of this. Like that was like a big like click for me. And I'm curious if you could speak to the role of education, or maybe the lack of education and critical thinking in the missing middle.
So this is actually kind of a hard question, because I hear this a lot from people I talk to in Arizona when we start talking about conspiracies. It's like, oh, well, they're just really uneducated. Both sides think the other side is really uneducated. And it's sort of problematic, because if you think through it, it's like, well, obviously if you had the right education, you would agree with me. Everyone who doesn't agree with me is clearly stupid. Well, that's probably not true. So what is the role of education? You can't really guarantee where education comes out, right? Like, all you can do is try and give people the tools, but then they might use their critical thinking tools to do great harm. I can think of a few examples. I'm not going to go into that right now. But so I don't think it's education, just educate. I think it's also about ethics, which is why your point was really strong. It's like, I feel like this isn't just like spirituality that's missing this particular section. I also think this a lot about like the tech industry, like we were talking last week. Like, where's the ethics? Where's like the evaluation, not just of value, like how much is stuff worth, but like values, like what do we care about? What is important? What do we actually think is right? And what are some of the consequences of our actions beyond just amassing more money and power, right? So what we need is ethics. And that's not the same as education. I think we got quite a lot of education, actually. I'm surrounded by very clever people.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting talk. The question that I have is, you talked about people moving from a structured religion to spirituality. What I'm curious about is, did you come across any children that came from a spiritual family that grew up and say at 25 years of age, 30 years of age, when the brain starts talking to each other, you know, both hemispheres of the brain start talking to each other. What was their opinion, or something along those lines?
Yeah, so I definitely did know children who grew up in spirituality, and in Sedona specifically, and they do, and I really don't want to be judgy here, but they don't make the greatest parents for a number of reasons. One is that they tend to not vaccinate their children, another is that they tend to homeschool. They think that children are closer to sort of source because they haven't sort of been, you know, polluted and corrupted by all of the stuff that we learn in adulthood. So children are sort of like more spiritual and more pure. There's like this notion of indigo children. So they just sort of let their children do whatever they want, which, look, I'm a parent. That's not the best way to raise your child. You know, you need boundaries, and they need an education, and they need to know what other people think beyond you. Like, you can't give your children everything by homeschooling, right? And so there are a few ways these children would turn out once they hit adulthood. Sometimes they were okay and they just sort of like moved to Phoenix and got a regular job. Sometimes they just sort of basically lived in vans their whole lives and kind of thought everything that they thought was really special and important, because that's what they've been told and been raised to. Some of them don't even have birth certificates or social security numbers because they don't want to register their child, because look, there's this whole conspiracy theory called redemption, which I'm not going to go into right now, but it just, like, trying to raise your child outside of the state causes all these complications for that child as they then become an adult and actually want to do things like, I don't know, get a passport or a job, right? And a lot of these children end up poorly equipped for the society that they live in because they've been raised with this sort of utopian hope that they are the new generation of this new society they're creating, but that they didn't actually create. So it does often end quite badly. Not in all cases. As I said, some of them do go to Phoenix and get a job. It's always Phoenix because there's more to do. There's nothing to do in Sedona for young people. Like nothing except hiking.
I have more just if you could expand on, I think it's a belief when you said that words have power. I don't think you can back up that with science. So what is, if you can...
No, and I wasn't making a scientific claim. That's what they think. They believe words have power and that words create reality. I don't think that. I say all kinds of things that don't go anywhere. Right? With my $1 million. So that's a claim that they make. That's not a claim I'm making. Oh. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. I wonder your concept on alignment, oneness with universe, and I wonder this kind of Upanishadic philosophy concept of Jivatma and Paramatma, whereas Paramatma is the universal soul and Jivatma is personal soul, and the attachment, the motive is personal soul to align with the universal soul. I appreciate this theory, yeah. And my concern is, in terms of spirituality, the people who are struggling with hardship situation and food and basic human needs. So in terms of that type of people, how they will get in spirituality, do you think about that? Or do you think in your spiritual concept, is it applicable? Because so many indigenous people who have a lot of numbers, sacred places, but in development concern and in capitalist theory, in many cases, people try to get in their land, and the locals who are struggling with economic conditions. So in that cases, that people have no spiritual things or spiritual ideas to save their sacred lands from the capitalist motives. Yeah, make sense? Or
So are spiritual people trying to save indigenous land?
yeah.
No.
No.
That's not what they're trying to do. Although, interestingly, I did know some people who were trying to... They asked me if I knew anyone who would help them get like donations. They were trying to buy the land that's at the source of the Verde River because they told me it was like the sacred land and sacred to indigenous people. And I was like, what is this group? Who is, like, is this connected to the Yavapai or any of the local indigenous tribes? And they were like, oh, it's connected spiritually to these Amazonian natives. And I was like, this is slightly suspicious. And I looked it up online, and it was just a bunch of people from Colorado, right? But they were like, no, the spiritual connection to the Amazon, that's what we're really trying to do here. So no, they're really bad on indigenous land rights. They're really bad on indigenous politics. They don't have a good, like, land-backed politics at all. Sorry, I have horrible allergies right now.
Yeah, well, welcome to Arizona.
I know, right? Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Evan, then Penny.
Dr. Crockford, thank you as always. Really appreciate hearing from you. This question, maybe I'm going to ask you about a conspiracy theory that I believe in.
Okay.
That's also something like a standard talking point in the academy. And that is that we live in a world governed by these almost invisible forces that we refer to broadly as neoliberalism.
Yes.
And that this invisible condition sort of lurking in the background everywhere is applied to different kinds of social features. And that's why we see similar kinds of developments happening in different spaces. So there have already been a couple of moments, both in your presentation and in the Q&A, about the ways in which the turn towards Christian nationalism and conspiracy theory in evangelical Christianity rhymes with things that are happening in the world of spirituality. And according to this conspiracy theory that I and probably others in this room believe in, this has something to do with neoliberalism, right? It has something to do with the atomization of the social fabric of our society. That's connected to economic forces, that's connected to the sort of the modes of cultural production that come from social media. You know, maybe it's not exactly a conspiracy theory because it's not, I'm not arguing that it's orchestrated by some, you know, localizable force, but I do think that this is something in the water out there. And so I guess the question is two parts. On the first hand, is the kind of thinking and analysis that this question is built around conspiracy theory? And second, what would you say about this sort of assertion that the reason we see these kinds of hyper-individualized you know, like I and the universe are directly connected with no middle, right? Your sort of basic argument you're making about cosmopolitics, is that explicable according to the logics of neoliberalism? Thank you.
So this is why I brought up the sort of fine line between conspiracy and critique. Because it is, right, especially if you are an academic and you make arguments about things like social forces, all right, systemic causality. You know, these are not things that we can identify to a specific person, and that's the whole work that those concepts are doing. What they're saying is that at a certain point, the aggregate of human actions produces forces that we can name, but we can't see, like I can see you in the room here. And this does sound like a lot of what if you hear people talk about deep state, chemtrails are doing too. And the way I kind of distinguish the two, because I think that one is doing something really important and one is doing something that's quite harmful, is that when you are making your critique of all these various social forces, what you're trying to do is identify this sort of level of the social and how it works, right? And how it may especially be working in a way that is harming people. And that's really important. And on the other hand, you have this sort of over-attribution of agency where you're not just identifying forces. What you're saying is, you know, there's a certain group of people who are doing this to us and it's an attack. Whereas the social critique is actually removing that personalization. It's saying, you know, it's not that specific people are trying to do this, even though you may be able to identify specific people. It's saying it has this force beyond that. And it's really important to name this force so that we can change it. So I had this conversation with someone this morning, actually. We were talking about seed oils, which I'd recently written about. And he was like, you know, it's good to have good, you know, diet and exercise, you know, and it's really important. I'm sure there's terrible things that happen with the food supply. And I'm like, yes, there are, which is why it's important to be accurate about it, because then you can do something about it. If you're making up stuff about seed oils, that's not going to help anyone. That's just muddying the waters. So it's sort of they're next to each other, but it's actually then really important to be accurate about your critique so that you don't slip into just making stuff up, even if you're sort of in the right area, right? So the other part is about neoliberalism, I think. Yes. So the whole argument of my book is basically that spirituality is like the religious part of neoliberalism. And you know, I always sort of get asked this question like, but what really is neoliberalism? So I try and be quite, again, specific about it, because I think you can be specific about it. There's a series of policies that were implemented first in the US and the UK by specific people. Again, we can name these people as like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and their administrations, and they did specific things that did change society, like undermining the welfare state. Right? Like, and you know, the effects of having this social safety net withdrawn was that we then became more individualized. It meant that regulations on the financial industry, for example, led to this financialization where everything is on the market, everything can be sold on the free market. You know, and there's a few other characteristics, which again, like I'm going to go on too long, but it's in my book. So I think you can be specific about neoliberalism just like you can be specific about your critique, and that's actually really important that we actually name these things accurately so that we can identify them and then do something about it.
Penny, then Hava.
I'll let Hava go first.
Oh.
That was sort of my
I was like,
Okay.
as well.
So 2011, Roger Gottlieb wrote a book, What is Spirituality in White Matters? I don't know if you're familiar with it. He's a religion and ecology scholar and an environmentalist. And what he's saying about spirituality is very different from the way you present it. So my question would be, what has changed? So maybe now you gave the answer. Neoliberalism is maybe the answer to my question. But I'm not totally sure, because I don't see much difference between what these people are doing now and what the 1960s was all about. So if there is a difference, what is the difference? And if there isn't, how do we explain the change conversation?
That's a good question. Sort of makes me wish I knew more about the 1960s beyond what I've seen in movies. But I think there is a difference. You know, I think that for the 60s, there was this sense of doing something collective, right, of coming together and trying to make that change through collective action, through various forms of protest, intentional communities, and that is what I would say has changed. That there isn't that sense that what we should do is collectivize to create action, that what we should be doing, and this is in spirituality, not me saying this, but is just our individual path. So they're no longer kind of joining together or trying to go back to the land and form intentional communities. What they're just trying to do is literally just work on their own specific spiritual path. And that is, if you kind of trace neoliberalism through things like an increase in personal responsibility and individualism, that's one of your outcomes, right? That you are responsible for your spirituality. It's not about joining with others. I'm not going to disagree with you on that.
Penny, did you want to ask your question, or
my question was sort of about white Christian nationalism, and I'm in a group. I'm in a couple of groups where 50% of the people are Jewish and 50% are Christian, and I'm one of the few people who really has much interest in religion per se. And when I talk about white Christian nationalism, because I feel like every time we meet I have to get something in about it, I can tell there's this blank look like they think it's some sort of a crazy conspiracy thing. They're beginning to figure it out. They're beginning to listen a little better, but a lot of people just have no realm of comparison or context of religion, like we were saying earlier. So they don't really know what we're talking about, even though you have all these wonderful authors out there writing about it.
Yeah, there is quite a lot written about white Christian nationalism. I always think that, everyone knows about this now, but that maybe is me living in my little academic bubble, because if you don't come across it, then you might not know it's going on at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And think it's just a conspiracy.
Yeah.
Just because the things that we talk about are the Proud Boys and all those people who are conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
And we lump them in, and they are the white Christian nationalists. So.
Yeah. And one of the problems with the term conspiracy theory is it just sort of becomes this way of delegitimizing the person that you're talking about, which can then also be flipped back on you. like a similar thing happened with the term fake news. Like that used to name something real, like the profusion of, false news articles that were created just to put content on the internet. And then it just got flipped around into anything that the speaker disagrees with. And I think it's one of those things that I don't really like using the word conspiracy theory, because I think it sort of undermines this sense that, people just believe really different things. It doesn't mean that they're, uneducated or mad. People believe really different things. And if you're in a church that is Christian nationalist, all of that will make sense to you and it will seem normal. And some of the most affecting books I've read about it are from people who used to be in those churches. Like there's one, Preparing for War by Bradley Anishi, that's really good because he was that. And he's like, no, I'm telling you they're preparing for war because I was. And I was like, well, that's terrifying. But if you're inside that church, that's just normal to you, right? It's not madness. It's not a conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory was always the outsider looking in and saying, well, that's wrong.
And one more thing, I do think Sedona is unusual compared to a lot of other spiritual ideas, which kind of what I think Hava and I are getting at is that a lot of the things you talked about the universal, and there's a lot of that goes on in regular religions that is not, but that is very transactional and commercial there.
Yeah, I would agree that Sedona is, it's sort of like, I quite like the description of it as like this very intense place, because it really does have this intensity that other places I've been, even looking at spirituality, don't have. But I think there are certain political economic conditions that produce that intensity in Sedona.
I know there's still a few hands up. We're going to have to call this part of the event to a close. But please don't go. You can grab something good to eat and stay on and bring your questions to Susannah if you like. But for now, please join me in giving a hand to our wonderful guest.